What if the moment they thought they were breaking Russia was actually the moment they were breaking the global financial order itself? On February 26, 2022, just 48 hours after Russian forces entered Ukraine, the United States and the European Union fired the financial nuclear option. They cut Russia off from SWIFT, the network tying together 11,000 banks across 200 countries and moving $5 trillion every day. It was supposed to be a death sentence, no international payments, no trade finance, no cross-border banking. Analysts predicted a collapsing ruble, a suffocating economy, and political pressure that would force Putin to retreat. But the collapse never came. Instead, something far more unsettling unfolded. Russia steadied itself. The ruble clawed back its losses. The economy adapted, and trade simply rerouted through new channels. And as this defiance played out, dozens of countries watched with growing alarm, realizing a dangerous truth: if America could unplug Russia for political reasons, it could unplug anyone. What looked like Western leverage was actually the ignition of a cycle the world has seen 4 times in 110 years. A cycle that always ends the same way. And in 2022, without realizing it, the West set that cycle in motion again. For decades, Washington treated SWIFT like a steel vault, only it could open a financial infrastructure so deeply wired into global banking that no major nation dared imagine life outside it. Yet history has always carried a darker warning every time a dominant power turns its financial system into a weapon. The blade eventually swings back toward the hand that wields it. You can trace this pattern over more than a century. In 1914, Britain controlled about 65% of global reserves. London reigned as the world's financial capital, and the pound sat unchallenged as the reserve currency. But the moment Britain froze German assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act, a line was crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Neutral countries saw London abandon the principle that international money should stay above politics, and they quietly began shifting gold and reserves to safer, more neutral centers. By 1944, at Bretton Woods, the dollar replaced the pound entirely, not because Germany defeated Britain, but because Britain broke trust. The same story unfolded in 1979. When the US froze $12 billion in Iranian assets, it achieved its tactical goal. The hostages were released by January 1981. But the shock to the global system was seismic. OPEC nations realized their dollar holdings in New York could be seized without warning. As a result, their dollar reserves slid from roughly 85% in 1977 to about 71% by 1991. The US gained leverage over Iran, but lost confidence from everyone else. Russia's 2014 sanctions fit the script as well. They weren't fatal, but they gave Moscow 8 years to prepare for something bigger. Russia cut its froze. Treasury holdings from $130 billion in 2013 to just $2 billion by 2020 increased its gold reserves from 1,000 tons to 2,300 tons, and built SPFS, their own alternative to SWIFT. Western commentators dismissed it all as posturing. Russia wasn't posturing, it was preparing. So in 2022, when the EU finally pulled the nuclear option, cutting Russia from SWIFT and freezing $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, the world didn't just see a punishment, it saw the mask come off the dollar system itself. If Washington could freeze a major power's reserves overnight, then no country's reserves were truly safe. Not China's, not India's, not Saudi Arabia's, not anyone's. What was meant to break Russia instead broke global trust. And the moment the U reached peak financial power was the same moment the long decline of dollar supremacy quietly began. To understand what unfolded in 2022, you have to trace a century of history for moments when a superpower thought it was tightening its grip, but was actually weakening its own foundation. And every cycle began not with chaos, but with confidence. In 1914, as World War I erupted, London controlled roughly 65% of global reserves. The pound's dominance felt immovable. But when Britain froze German assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act, a subtle shift began. German companies suffered, yet neutral nations focused on Britain, realizing their money was safe in London only if their politics aligned with the empire. Quietly, they moved reserves to New York, Paris, and into gold. By 1920, the US held more gold than Britain. By 1925, New York rivaled London, and by 1944 at Bretton Woods, the dollar replaced the pound, an outcome rooted in Britain's decision to weaponize finance 30 years earlier. The United States repeated the pattern in 1979. After Iranian revolutionaries seized American hostages, President Carter froze $12 billion in Iranian assets, the largest freeze ever attempted. It created immediate pressure. The hostages were released in January 1981, but the broader effect was deeper. OPEC states realized their dollar reserves could be frozen with a single decision. Their diversification began. Dollar holdings dropped from about 85% in 1977 to roughly 71% by 1991, shifting into Deutsche Marks, Yen to gold, and accounts in London, Zurich, and Singapore. The US gained leverage over Iran, but lost trust across the region. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the US imposed sanctions but avoided the swift cutoff, giving Moscow 8 years to prepare. Russia rewired its financial position, cutting US Treasury holdings from $130 billion in 2013 to just $2 billion in 2020, raising gold reserves from 1,000 tons to 2,300 tons by 2022, and building trade channels with China and India using yuan, rubles, and rupees. It created SPFS, its alternative to SWIFT, and adopted a national strategy based on one belief: dollar reserves were unsafe. Western analysts dismissed it, but Russia was preparing. So when the full strike came on February 26, 2022, Russia cut from SWIFT and $300 billion of central bank reserves frozen. The shock was immediate. The ruble fell 30% in 48 hours. ATMs emptied, markets froze, but Russia stabilized. The central bank raised rates to 20%. Gas payments were forced into rubles. Oil rerouted to China, India, and the Middle East. Trade settled in yuan, rupees, and dirhams. By 2023, Russian GDP grew 3.6%, outpacing Germany and the UK. The weapon meant to isolate Russia ended up isolating the dollar. And here, the hidden mechanism becomes clear. Every time a superpower weaponizes its financial system, the same dominoes fall, the target adapts. Neutral nations hedge, and the system that once looked unshakable begins to fracture under its own coercive pressure. This isn't just a story of 1914, 1979, 2014, or even 2022. It's the recurring physics of financial dominance, and the moment a nation turns its system into a weapon is the moment that system starts slipping from its hands. When you line up the events of the last century, what first looks random becomes the outline of a machine, an old mechanism that activates whenever an empire believes its financial system is too essential to be challenged. The US stepped into that machine in 2022, but the gears had been spinning long before. It always begins with control. From 1973 to 2022, the US didn't own SWIFT, but didn't need to. The network sat in Belgium, yet most messages cleared in dollars through New York. Treasury sanctions could block banks, the Federal Reserve could cut clearing access, and a system involving 11,000 banks across 200 countries ultimately depended on American approval. Dollar dominance created an illusion that nothing could move without Washington. Control inevitably tempts weaponization. After 9/11's financial pressure became a standard tool used on terrorists, then Iran, North Korea, and Russia in 2014. By 2022, sanctions felt routine. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, cutting it off from SWIFT seemed procedural, not risky. But once the strike is made, the target adapts. Russia moved fast. By 2024, around 40% of its trade left the dollar system. Commerce with China hit $240 billion, mainly in yuan and rubles. Trade with India reached $65 billion in rupees. Deals with the UAE settled in dirhams. SPFS grew. China's CIPS became Russia's main channel. Crypto, barter, and local currencies filled gaps. What was meant as a financial death sentence proved SWIFT wasn't the prison the West assumed. The real transformation came from nations not under attack but afraid they might be next. China cut treasuries from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to $775 billion by 2024. Its official gold rose to 264 tons, with estimates above 4,000. CIPS went from $300 billion in 2021 to over $500 billion in 2024. Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil in 2023 and joined BRICS in 2024. The UAE settled trade with India in rupees and dirhams. Europe created Instex. Japan and South Korea increased yuan reserves. More than 50 central banks tested alternatives to SWIFT and the dollar. What followed wasn't anger, but fear. A recognition that reserves held in dollars were governed not by neutrality, but by politics. and politics can flip overnight. This is the hidden mechanism once a dominant power uses its financial system as a weapon. That system becomes the battlefield, trust erodes, alternatives multiply, and the architecture that made the empire strong begins to fracture under its own leverage. The Yuan believed it was punishing Russia. Instead, it awakened a world that no longer trusted the system America built. What made 2022 so destabilizing wasn't just the strike on Russia, it was the quiet aftershocks that spread far beyond Moscow. The real story sits in the subtle moments when the world shifted course, when an action meant to reinforce the dollar system instead loosened its bolts. These twists weren't loud, they were nearly silent, but they changed everything. The first twist appeared the moment Russia survived. Washington intended to break the Kremlin, yet the world saw something more consequential, a major power proving it could function outside the dollar SWIFT system. By redirecting oil, settling trade in yuan, rupees, and dirhams, expanding SPFS, and leaning on China's CIPS network, Russia showed that an escape route existed. For dozens of nations watching, this shattered the belief that the dollar order was unavoidable. If Russia could withstand the most severe sanctions in modern history, then perhaps anyone could. And once that idea takes root, the global financial architecture begins to shift. The second twist hit the energy markets. For nearly 50 years, the petrodollar operated like gravity. But in 2023 and 2024, that pull weakened. Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil. Russia sold oil to India in rupees. The UAE took dirhams and yuan. Iran sold to China in yuan. Iraq began negotiating yuan use. These moves didn't topple the dollar overnight, but they broke its monopoly, and once a monopoly cracks, it never reseals. Like a dam opening hairline fractures, the pressure begins to find every path forward. The third twist came with BRICS. The bloc expanded from 5 to 9 members, representing 45% of the world's population, 36% of GDP, and 42% of global oil production. At the 2023 Johannesburg Summit, they announced plans for a commodity-backed currency: gold, oil, rare earths. It didn't need to launch, the signal alone mattered. So, for the first time in decades, the dollar could see its rivals forming in plain sight. The geopolitical landscape was reorganizing not around ideology, but around insulation from US's financial power. Stepping back, the pattern is unmistakable. Russia's resilience cracked the psychological barrier. The petrodollar's erosion cracked the structural one. BRICS' rise cracked the diplomatic one. 3 fractures, reinforcing one another, pushing the world away from a system once seen as unshakable. None of it came with noise. It moved like a passing shadow, quiet, steady, irreversible. When you shift from the history books to the present moment, the pattern no longer feels theoretical. It becomes visible, etched into the numbers, reflected in every trade flow, every reserve shift, every quiet policy change happening in capitals around the world. The decline of dollar dominance isn't an argument anymore. It's a data set. Take Russia. In 2021, nearly 87% of its trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, that figure had collapsed to roughly 60%, with the remaining 40% conducted in yuan, rubles, rupees, dirhams, and other non-Western currencies. That drop isn't ideological, it's survival. And once a G20 economy proves it can rewire its trade so drastically, the old assumptions about dollar inevitability begin to dissolve. Or look at China's CIPS, the alternative clearing system that once seemed like a side project. In 2020, it processed about $12 trillion in payments. By 2023, that number exploded to $27 trillion, more than doubling in 3 years. Today, CIPS links over 1,400 financial institutions across 110 countries. Settling transactions in yuan, an unmistakable sign that the plumbing of global finance is quietly shifting eastward. It's not a theory. It's throughput. It's volume. It's scale. Meanwhile, China has stitched together currency swap agreements with more than 40 countries, totaling roughly $500 billion, giving its partners the ability to trade without touching the dollar at all. Across Southeast Asia, leaders have opened discussions on settling regional trade in local currencies. Central bank vaults worldwide are filling with gold purchases exceeding 1,000 tons in 2022, 2023, and 2024, the highest sustained buying streak since the 1970s. They're not hoarding gold because they love shiny metal. They're doing it because gold can't be frozen, sanctioned, or electronically seized. Even the most loyal numbers tell the same story. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024, with a 4 percentage point decline in just the last 2 years, the fastest pace on record. Nations aren't waiting for a crisis. They're adjusting in advance, like passengers slowly shifting to one side of a ship long before anyone officially announces it's taking on water. But the most chilling data point isn't about reserves or trade or gold. It's the one tied directly to the moment the U.S. deployed its greatest financial weapon. When Washington used the SWIFT cutoff in 2022, it triggered the same paradox every empire encounters. A nuclear option can only be used once, the moment it's deployed. Everyone else begins building bunkers. Russia built alternatives. China expanded its parallel systems. BRICS grew. Regional payment networks multiplied. And now, anyone who might one day face American pressure has already begun constructing their shield. The U.S. didn't just use the SWIFT weapon. It ended its era of unchallenged power. Not with a war, not with a collapse, but with a decision that taught the world exactly how to defend itself. To understand where the world stands, you have to zoom out to see the pattern and then zoom in to realize we're already deep inside it. The 5 stages aren't theory, they're a cycle empires repeat, always assuming they're the exception. The United States isn't at the start of that cycle. It's nearing the end. For decades, Washington sat securely in stage 1. Control felt effortless. SWIFT relied on dollar settlement through New York. The Treasury could sanction. The Federal Reserve could deny clearinghouse access. The system funneled through American infrastructure. SWIFT was Belgian in name, but its lifeline ran through New York. Stage 2 came when control turned into temptation. From 2001 to 2022, the U.S. normalized financial pressure used on terrorists. Iran, North Korea, then Russia. By 2022, sanctions weren't extraordinary. They were routine. Stage 3 began the moment Russia realized it had no choice but to build around the blockade. SPFS expanded. CIPS became its main artery. 40% of its trade shifted outside the dollar. Oil flowed in yuan, rupees, dirhams. Crypto and barter filled gaps. A nation as large as Russia proving it could operate outside the dollar wasn't just adaptation, it was precedent. And precedent spread. Stage 4 accelerated everything. Neutral nations watching carefully started hedging. China cut treasuries from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to about $775 billion in 2024. Its gold rose to 264 tons, with estimates above 4,000. CIPS processed about $300 billion in 2021 and over $500 billion in 2024. Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil in 2023 and joined BRICS in 2024. The UAE settled with India in rupees and dirhams. Europe built Insta-X. Japan and South Korea increased yuan reserves. Over 50 central banks tested ways to bypass SWIFT. The world didn't attack the U.S. It simply stopped depending on it. And that leads to stage 5, the erosion of the weapon itself. The dollar's reserve share slid from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024, with a 4-point drop in just 2 years. Digital networks scaled rapidly. CIPS volume jumped from $12 trillion in 2020 to $27 trillion in 2023. Technology is speeding up a process that once took generations. Britain weaponized finance in 1914. In 1944, the dollar replaced the pound. The US weaponized SWIFT in 2022. By that rhythm, dollar dominance points toward an end around 2042, perhaps earlier as digital integration accelerates. If that trajectory continues, reserves could fall to 40% by 2040. Demand for USOI treasuries collapses, interest rates rise, multi-trillion-dollar deficits become impossible. A standard of living built on importing more than it exports begins to fade not suddenly, but slowly, predictably. This isn't America collapsing. It's America becoming normal, one major power in a multipolar world, no longer protected by the privilege of issuing the world's default currency. Financial exceptionalism doesn't end with a crash. It ends the way it always has, through the quiet withdrawal of global trust. There's a particular kind of tragedy that doesn't come from being defeated by an enemy, but from being undone by your own strength. That's the shape of America's moment. The end isn't arriving because China built a rival system, or because Russia rerouted its oil, or because BRICS expanded, or because SIPS doubled its throughput. Those are symptoms. The cause runs deeper. Buried in the quiet contradiction that has haunted every financial empire for a century, the tools that give you power are the tools that can take it away. For the dollar to rule the world. Nations had to believe their reserves were untouchable, that money stored in New York or cleared through American banks existed outside politics. But financial dominance is made of trust, not fear, and trust dies the second a system becomes a weapon. Britain discovered that in 1914, when it froze German assets and unknowingly marked the beginning of the pound's decline. The United States discovered it again in 1979 when freezing $12 billion in Iranian assets convinced OPEC states that their wealth could be seized at any moment. Russia internalized the lesson in 2014, spending 8 years preparing for the possibility that its dollar reserves could vanish overnight. And in 2022, when the US and EU froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, the rest of the world finally absorbed the meaning of all those earlier warnings. If the entire savings of a major power can be locked with an executive order, then no sovereign wealth is truly sovereign. Countries didn't diversify because they opposed the US. They diversified because they understood the math of vulnerability. Because every reserve held in dollars came with a silent asterisk, safe unless Washington changes his mind. The shift away from the dollar isn't loud or frantic, it's quiet, methodical, almost geological. Russia settling trade outside the dollar, China scaling CIPS. Central banks buying more than 1,000 tons of gold 3 years in a row, Saudi Arabia accepting yuan for oil after 50 years of exclusivity. Each move is small on its own. Together, they resemble sand slipping out from under the foundation of a once unshakable structure. The decline won't come as a crash or a crisis. There will be no single day when the dollar falls. Instead, it will feel like a long exhale, a slow erosion of privilege, a steady narrowing of options. The dollar will remain important, but no longer singular. It will be one currency among several, not the gravitational center all others orbit, not the world's anchor, just another weight on the scale. This is how empires lose financial hegemony, not through invasion, not through defeat, but through overreach, by mistaking compliance for trust, by assuming a system built on confidence could be controlled by force. And by the time the consequences appear in daylight, the machinery has already been running in the dark for years. In the end, the most powerful blow to the dollar didn't come from Moscow or Beijing or Johannesburg. It came from Washington when it decided to weaponize the very architecture that made the dollar indispensable, and in doing so, revealed to the world that indispensability was an illusion. What's happening now isn't the collapse of a currency, it's the quiet rewriting of the global monetary order, not with explosions, with whispers, not through losing a war, through losing the world's trust. And once trust is gone, no empire in history has ever gotten it back. If this story opened your eyes to a pattern hiding in plain sight, if it shifted how you understand power, money, and the invisible architecture running beneath global politics, then don't look away now. The world is rebuilding its financial foundation in real time. And the next chapter isn't being drafted in Washington, but in the countries quietly constructing alternatives to the system they once depended on. Because when the U.S. cut Russia from SWIFT in February 2022 and froze $300 billion of its reserves, the countdown began. Not to Russia's collapse, but to the slow unwinding of American financial supremacy. That moment taught nations that trust could be revoked overnight. And once that truth is learned, it can't be unlearned. The shift won't explode. It will unfold steady, silent, inevitable. So stay aware, stay curious. Because 20 years from now, historians will look back at that decision in 2022 and mark it as the turning point, the moment the dollar's uncontested era ended. Long before most people realized the world had already begun to change.